Currently 8:07. Special guest in the studio is Ken Rockburn. He's a Canadian radio and television journalist and host. He's most notable for his associations with the Canadian Cable Public Affairs Channel, otherwise known as CPAC. He spent some time with the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, CBC, of course, Shea FM. What's not mentioned here on his Wikipedia page is that he's also alumni of CKCU. He joins me now. Should I update that, or do you have a crew to update that Wikipedia
My
page?
My peeps. I don't even know who did that page, to tell you the truth. So,
No?
I have no
Well,
idea.
it's these. That's the cool thing about Wikipedia. You put in entries, and I can go in there and correct it, and it may or may not stay there.
Oh, okay.
Because they review all changes almost immediately.
Oh, really?
And if I wrote in saying Ken's an ass, they would find that and they would erase it.
Would they check with me first?
No. But yeah,
so I said, if I agree,
I'm gonna make sure I update that to make sure at least CKCU is included there.
Yeah. But it actually would be Radio Carleton, because it was prior to CKCU. It wasn't CKCU.
And so let's go all the way back to those days, and you may be able to answer a question. We went on air in 75.
Yep.
The station existed pre-75, both as a carrier current, meaning just here in the tunnels or different rooms, and then FM. This place only opened, though, in 1970. Were you here prior to 1970?
Yes, I was. I was here in 68.
So where was the station in 68?
It was...
specifically, I need to go to that room.
Well, okay, it was T8, the Tunnel Junction. It was near the Tunnel Junction, and it was room T8. I don't even know whether it still exists or not. And it was one small room, and we had an old console from, I want to say...
CFMO?
I can't remember. No, it was from a radio station in Hull, what was then known as Hull, that had some smoke damage in a fire. And the people who were involved at Radio Carleton at the time got this thing, and somebody refurbished it, and that's what was being used. And when I first started doing stuff with Radio Carleton, it was the broadcasts, such as they were. There was one speaker at the Tunnel Junction. That was it. You might as well have had a tin can with a wire on the end of it. That's what we were doing. And there was also a half-hour Radio Carleton program that ran, I think, late on Sunday night on CKOI.
Right, that's the station.
Yeah, and I got involved in that a little bit. And then I became station manager, and then the Unicenter opened. They built the Unicenter, and we're opening that. And this space was the space. And so myself and... I just became Facebook friends with him now for like 45 years later. Our engineer, Roland Orley. Roland and I were the ones who basically designed the space and planned everything out. And we had a budget. The radio station had a budget, so we got a lot of equipment, put stuff in. And then he and I spent an entire summer crawling behind the tunnel walls, because there are spaces back there. You don't want to know about them, I'm telling you.
It's
but
plumbing. It's where all the pipes.
It's just brutal.
Yeah.
And in the height of summer, when it's really hot and humid, it's even worse. And we spent the entire summer just dragging lines, and we hooked up a whole bunch of other locations, and then we did carrier current in the res buildings at the time. And so that was the first expansion.
Were you part of getting the space that we currently have?
Yeah.
How was that possible? Did you put in a proposal?
Yeah,
to
I
the
mean,
president?
Radio Carleton was one of the clubs. It was just as legitimate as the newspaper. And in fact, where we're sitting now, the Charlatan was right across the hall, where CKCU's main offices, where I was just sitting a few minutes ago. That was the Charlatan offices. Those were the Charlatan offices. Yeah, at the time. So we sort of split it. Now the guys at the Charlatan back then were they were really cool guys. A guy named Richard Labonte, Phil Kinsman, who may be listening to us today. I don't know. They're all these guys, and they were. So there was a real symbiotic relationship between the newspaper, and it had been, just prior to that, it had been called the Carleton, and it was Richard Labonte who changed the name to the Charlatan, and the name stuck.
Makes sense.
Richard ran for president of CUSA as a member of the Area and Affairs Committee as a joke, and he won.
Oh. Wow. Was it a big deal asking for this amount of floor space? Because you went from a closet to...
I don't think it was that big a deal. I think the original, when they were planning the building, the idea was that there would be this space, that it was a legitimate thing. And it wasn't connected to the School of Journalism. That's something else that happened the following year, when a fellow named John Ferguson, who went on to work for Canadian Press for many years, he and I approached the School of Journalism about using the Radio Carleton facilities because they didn't teach broadcast journalism at the School of Journalism then. It was a print-oriented course for 3 years. The following year, there was a 3-year course, and then there was a 1-year post-grad course that people could take. And it became a 4-year course a couple of years later. But we approached the guy who was the head of the school then, School of Journalism, Joe Scanlon, and he rebuffed us, to put it mildly. And then he went away on a sabbatical for a year. And one of the profs named Phyllis Wilson, who people might remember, who went to this place, she was running the school. And we went to her, and she thought it was a good idea. So they set up radio journalism training for the second-year students and for the post-grad students. And they used Radio Carleton as
the
studio. So they would come in and they would do broadcasts that would be broadcast to all these locations, and it would be mostly campus stuff at that point, and a little bit of national and international news. They'd get off the wires that they had at the School of Journalism, that sort of thing, and that worked out really well. It was, but the irony, of course, was that because John and I had made this proposal, they assumed that we knew what we were talking about, and I was asked to every week go to the courses, the second year and the post-grad courses, and critique the radio stories that these students were writing. And I had no idea. I was faking it. But I did that for easily 3 or 4 months. Every week I went.
Were you fair?
And I thought I was very fair. And then come the new year, it would have been 1971, I guess. I think it was 71. I thought, well, if I can get away with this nonsense, then what good is this degree? And so I quit.
Really?
I dropped out like 4 months before I was going to graduate, and I went off to drive cab. How's that for a career decision?
Really?
Yeah.
So you weren't here when we got the FM license?
No, I wasn't, and I'm sure that Matthew Crozier, sitting over there in his office, is chuckling away right now because I intervened against it.
No,
I did. And he's got the.
Well, wait,
he says he's got the proposal.
Well, Shay wasn't on the air.
No,
yet.
Shay wasn't on the air.
Shay played a role later on with
Yes.
our advertising issues. Really?
I did.
Wait, how could you? In what capacity?
How could you?
As a cab driver?
As a cab driver.
As a cab driver, it's like, no, I don't want them to get an FM license.
No, it was, well, more or less, yeah. No, the original proposal that was put in, I thought that it was overreaching. And my fear then, I should put this in some kind of context. Yeah. I was involved with another group called Living Radio Vivant. It was a community. We were going after a listener-sponsored, publicly supported, nonprofit radio station. And we had little studios down in Lower Town and stuff. So we were doing a lot of work. We were living off of, back then, the Liberal Party so graciously put up things like opportunities for youth grants and the local initiatives project. So we were living off these grants and trying to get this thing going. And the CRTC at the time that was licensing all these things was looking at the idea of starting to license low-power community nonprofit radio stations, listener-sponsored radio stations. And then there wasn't a differentiation between university stations and college stations and community stations. So the fear was that Radio Carleton had proposed so much, and I wasn't sure that they could pull it off. And the fear was that if they got the license and then blew it within a year, it would blow it for all of us. That was my concern. Turned out I was completely wrong, but that's not unusual.
No, but at that time, that seems like a reasonable and valid concern.
I thought so. I was afraid I was going to get the crap beaten out of me, though. So it was a non-appearing intervention, and the hearings were in Hamilton, Ontario. Right, that's where it all took place. And I drove down and sat in the back of the room to watch it. That's why I made it a non-appearing. I didn't want to appear and sit in front of the CRTC with all these people from Radio Carleton behind me saying, "Don't give them a license."
But there was a substantial gap. I mean, I guess we went for the license in 74 and got it in 75.
Yeah.
And you were out of here at 71, driving a cab.
That's me.
So you were out of this business for 2-3 years.
Yeah.
But you were still...
Well, I was still doing it. I just wasn't doing it here.
It.
Yeah, and I was doing the community radio thing.
Oh, okay. Where was this community radio thing? Where?
It was radio on television, ironically enough. It was... we had little studios in a building at St. Patrick and Dalhousie, and we had a number of ethnic groups and... even the postal workers. The postal workers did a radio program.
They needed to at that
time. They
They
did. Yeah, they were really. This is Jean-Claude Perrault and all those guys when they were really militant, right?
Yeah.
But they happened to have their local locals office was in the same building that we were in, so that's how we got to know them. And so, but we had a bunch of various ethnic groups in the city would do programs in different languages. It was that sort of thing, right? And so we had these little studios. They'd come in and we'd show them how to do stuff. We'd get it all set up. And then back then, cable television in Ottawa was split down. Bank Street was the dividing line, and west of Bank Street it was Ottawa Cablevision, and east of Bank Street it was Skyline Cablevision. And we got both of them to agree to allow us to use the audio portion of their channel, their community channel, which didn't have any programming on it at that point.
Right.
So this logo that we had, that somebody had designed, which is an old-fashioned tube radio with a hand with a microphone on it coming through the middle of it, that was our logo. And that would be on screen, and then these programs would come on.
Sounds cool. Okay, and we'll move forward a bit because I want to do a bit of your legend in Ottawa.
Yeah, okay.
Well, you are. Come on. Like, everyone knows you. You were the news director at Shea.
I was.
How?
Not initially, I wasn't.
No. How did you get in the...
I got hired as the community relations director because one of the things I did was I went back to school afterwards and I got a diploma in community development, so that was my fallback position, and so I got hired when the station was starting up. Harvey Glatt, my old friend Harvey Glatt, and a guy named Tim Thomas, who was the consultant at the time, approached me because I've been doing this stuff for Living Radio, and they also knew that I've been involved in Radio Carleton as well. And they asked if I'd be interested in doing this, and so I would be part of the newsroom, and it would be to coordinate, because back then the CRTC, their big thing then was to have access to FM stations for community groups, essentially, right? So I was supposed to be in charge of that, but because there were only to begin with, there were only three of us in the newsroom, and they again made this huge commitment to the CRTC to have not just these 15-minute news and sportscasts, 15 minutes, because that was considered a Canadian content chunk. 15 minutes. That's how you got your Canadian content. Or foreground format programming, it was called. So we had to have a certain amount of spoken word programming. So newscast, it was a 10-minute newscast, 2 minutes of ads, 3 minutes of sports. And that was like maybe 4 times a day or something. And then we had to do an hour of public affairs programming 5 days a week. And then on the weekends, on Sunday mornings, we did the thing called the Week on Sunday Morning, and it was a recap of the highlights of interviews that had gone on it was called Shea Ottawa during the week. So I was responsible for those. A guy named Steve Brown was the news director, and a fellow named Randy Burgess, who I hope is listening. Randy got hired straight out of Algonquin to work in the newsroom. And then a little while later, we had to hire another person, and it came down to 2 women, and the one we hired, Sheila Bird, ended up being my wife.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Wow. And then you became news director.
Yeah, then I left. I left in a huff, like I do.
Okay.
Sheila and I got married. We went away on our honeymoon for a week, and we came back. And I went into a meeting with the station manager, who was the late Chuck Azzarello. He and I had a very interesting relationship over the long term. He believed in astrology, and he did everything based on astrology. And I think astrology is a crock, and so that was the basis for our relationship.
Wait a minute, can't you meet the astrology issue in the middle somewhere?
No, there's no meeting in the middle.
No,
not at all.
No, okay.
So this was a very big deal. Anyway, I went back into a meeting as soon as the day that I got back from my honeymoon. I went to a meeting with Chuck and Steve, and they had arbitrarily made this decision that affected the newsroom. And I won't go into the details, but it was something that I didn't agree with. And I just said, well, then screw you. I quit, and I walked out. And I went down to the newsroom first and said to my new wife, I'll see you at home tonight. I just quit. And she just, what?
Oh, no.
And I left. And so I was gone for 2 years. And then I did some contract work with Indian Affairs using my community development stuff. So I went around, I worked on reserves across the country and stuff for a couple of years. And then Steve Brown left, and there were tentative feelers put out by Chuck towards me to see if I'd be interested in coming back as news director. And we finally got together in a bar somewhere, and I agreed to go back, and I was there for the next, I don't know, however many years.
Like 10 years, I think.
Yeah, 10 or 12.
Now, not only were you news director, you did your own news show at noonish.
Yeah, well, we did the current affairs show. Shea Ottawa was the current affairs show, and then I did a thing on Sunday night called Medium Rare.
Medium Rare, yeah. No, I remember. Again, you were here a couple of years ago. I remember telling you that this. Then I'm going to repeat it. I listened to you religiously because I had issues with CKCU. I would go back and forth because sometimes the programming or the music would just make me insane, and I need something a bit more level. So I went to Shea, listened to your show. I'm pretty sure it was on at noon for almost an hour.
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
and you did some pretty in-depth research on some pretty hot button issues, such as cancer. And I'll never remember. I'll never forget. Basically, you did. I don't know. I think you did I love the report.